All right. I'm Anna Rose, and I'm the Exhibitions and Programming Associate at the Wende. And thank you all for joining us today. This is the 12th program in our Cold War Spaces series. Today's guest is Yevgeniy Fiks on the topic of aesthetic space, artistic interpretations of Cold War history. He's a Moscow-born artist based in New York. Work has been shown internationally from New York to Philadelphia to Moscow and Mexico City. If any viewers here remember a 2019 exhibition, War of Nerves, that included a number of prints from his series, Homosexuality is Stalin's Atomic Bomb to Destroy America, which posed a cutout image of the first Soviet nuclear test explosion at a number of known gay cruising sites in Washington, D.C. I'm very much looking forward to hearing him discuss some of his other Cold War-related projects today. So this will be a 30-minute interview by Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. After that, we'll leave about 15 minutes for Q&A, so you can get your questions ready to type in the Q&A box during that time. And we appreciate all of your questions, even if we can't get to them all. We also ask that you please keep your questions short and concise. And afterwards, we'll post the recording of this talk to our Vimeo page, and if you'd like to share this one or go back and watch previous programs, you can find them there. I'd also like to thank Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting our discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And now I'll hand it off to you to start the interview.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Rose. So there are many ways to reflect on the past, and people constantly create and recreate their story of their lives based on a selection of personal memories. Historians construct a narrative of the past informed by their interpretation of historical sources, using their black magic to force chaotic fragments into a single coherent story. Artists may mix fact and fiction to evoke a specific experience or to forge a meaningful connection between past and present. Many of Yevgeniy Fiks' art projects are visual storytelling steeped in Cold War history. Today we are going to talk about several of his Cold War-inspired, thought-provoking series of works. Yevgeniy, welcome to Cold War Spaces.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Yus. Thank you, Anna Rose, for the intro.
It's a pleasure to have you. And let me start with a more general question. There are many ideas about the deeper meaning or purpose of art. And some people believe that art should be an expression of one's time. You are reflecting on history. So how do you see the connection between past and present, generally speaking, in your work?
I think a lot of my projects deal with unresolved histories. So with historical narratives that remain incomplete. And in that way, the past creeps into the present, or at least in the present, we cannot say that, with most certainty that a particular historical narrative completed, right? So I think in that way, working with unresolved issues, with unresolved histories, keeps my work, I hope, more or less up to date, connected to the present. But yes, I take historical narrative, something that happened, and still continuing in some way, right? Our interpretation of it is not settled. It's still a questionable or thought-provoking historical facts that, well, that don't let us relax in the present.
Right. Would you go as far as to say that the present time actually informs your reaching back into the history?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I'm making my work now. Most of my work was done the last couple of decades, last 15 years or so. So I'm definitely making my work, living in New York and, being a Russian American artist living in New York. So I'm definitely making my work in the present.
Right. And why the specific focus on the Cold War in your case?
So I think a lot, so my concern with the Cold War has to do with my kind of general concern with the post-Soviet legacy, a post-Soviet reflection on the Soviet history, on the history of Soviet American relations, social relations, political relations. So in that way, the Cold War definitely figures very prominently in many of my projects because, well, I guess you can take it out of the kind of Soviet American narrative, right?
Right, right. So as an artist, you were researching the past, and I was wondering, do you think there is a fundamental difference or a gradual difference maybe between your approach of history and how, say, an historian or a museum curator would research the past?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think my approach is different in a sense that I take more liberties, right? I take more liberty when I work with a particular historical narrative. Up to a certain point, I was trying to avoid mixing any fiction into my projects. So maybe the last 5 years, I got a little bit more relaxed and I'm introducing more fiction into my work. But even before, I think, when I was trying to stick primarily to facts, I was still taking certain liberties that a proper historian, proper art historian, a proper curator would not have done, would not have taken. And I guess it's part of a kind of a group of projects, a group of artists that address the archive or history in a queer way, right? And taking certain liberties that I guess you can only take if you're an art practitioner rather than an academic historian.
Okay, great. And we'll discuss some examples of that later in this interview. Before we go into your work, I have one other question, something that struck me when reading about some of your projects. You described your work as a critical kind of nostalgia. And that sounds a bit contradictory to me because nostalgia is usually associated with a lack of critical faculties. So how do you make sense of this combination of criticism and nostalgia?
Sure. So I was really influenced by the book by Svetlana Boehm, who recently passed away, called The Future of Nostalgia. And she distinguishes between two types of nostalgia. A restorative nostalgia, nostalgia that makes you want to go into the past and reclaim the past in an uncritical manner, to return to this, wonderful Adam, right, into this lost, beautiful past. So that's the restorative nostalgia that Svetlana Boehm mentions. And the second type that she discusses is the so-called reflective nostalgia. So nostalgia that is not restorative, right? You're not trying to go back and reclaim the exact past that is no longer there, but rather you going into the past to find points of criticality, right? So maybe going back in history and finding a particular moment when certain possibilities were open, certain openings existed, right? That later closed down, and trying to work with these kind of possibilities, so these points of imagination or points of the possible.
Yeah,
was then
basically historical perspectives that were never fulfilled, promises that were never fulfilled.
True,
right?
true.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah. So let's discuss a few of your projects, and several of them actually focus on Birobidzhan, which was is the Jewish autonomous region formerly in the Soviet Union and now in the Russian Federation, not far from the Chinese border. So can you tell us, first of all, very briefly a little bit what Birobidzhan is, and then what triggered your interest in this place?
Sure, sure. If you don't mind, I open my slides so I can show you the map of where it is. I think it's going to be helpful for the viewers. Let me share my screen. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So Birbijan is a capital city of the Jewish Autonomous Region, which is in the far east of the Russian Federation and the past far east of the Soviet Union. So you can see Moscow. Here's Birbijan. You can see its size. So it's an area that was designated as a Soviet Jewish homeland in the late 20s. And in 1934, it got an official status of a Jewish autonomous region. And it had a very mixed, kind of complex history because it never really picked up. It's kind of an unsuccessful project. De jure, it still exists. So I traveled there in 2017. So it does exist, but as a kind of viable Soviet Jewish republic, so to say, it never realized. And I've been really fascinated with this history. So I've been doing some projects on this subject since 2009, and I did many projects, I think maybe 5. And one of them, I'll show you one of the most recent ones. I think it's funny. So it's called Diocese of Verbija. So when I went to Birbijan in 2017, I photographed all the Eastern Orthodox churches and church-related buildings that were built in Birbijan after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because all over the Russian Federation since the 90s has been a great kind of renaissance of Eastern Orthodox Church, but I guess of all religions, and Birbijan, of course, became also part of this renaissance. And since the majority of the population of Birbijan are Eastern Orthodox Russians, so of course it's natural that churches and Eastern Orthodox churches were built there. But I find it interesting, kind of contradictory. It was supposed to be a Soviet Jewish secular republic, and now there are no Jewish people living there. But and the most kind of exciting buildings built post 1991 in Birbijan, Eastern Orthodox churches, and I combine them with the names of the churches, the titles of the churches in Yiddish.
Right. Are there still synagogues as well, and are they still being?
In the Soviet era, there was one synagogue, I think, like in a small, almost like a private one-story building. And then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a new synagogue was built, and it's headed by a Chabad Lubavitch rabbi, which is kind of a string of Judaism that is very brave, and they go to far locations and establish congregations and build buildings and so on.
Right, right. So I wanted to ask you about one other series focused on Birbijan, the Pleshka Birbijan, in which you tell the fictional story of a group of gay men who in 1934 traveled to the place in the expectation to find their queer utopia there, if I understand it correctly. So you are more or less combining two stories, and one real, one more fictional, about two different minorities in the Soviet Union. What was the idea behind that project?
Yes, well, I've been doing a lot of work at the beginning from a kind of a general Soviet perspective, right? Like I'm a post-Soviet working in New York, so this is the work that I do. That's what I think I should say, from my, historical and geographical, position. But then around 2009, 2008, I wanted to do work that on one side would address issues that have to do with me personally, so the Jewish narrative and gay narrative are personally important to me, but also I wanted to create a more complex kind of a narrative about the Soviet history. And I think that's how I turned to projects that have to do with Soviet gay history or Soviet Jewish history. So the Pleshka Birobidzhan project. So it's not 100. So it's part fiction, part fact, and the opening, kind of a conceptual opening into this project, is year 1934. So year 1934 is a year when male homosexuality was recriminalized in the Soviet Union under Stalin and remained criminalized until 1993 in the Russian Federation, I think until 1992 in post-Soviet Ukraine. So there is some variety of experiences. But also in 1934, Birobidzhan was established as a Jewish autonomous region of the Soviet Union. So this year of 1934 conceptually is very important to me, because on one hand, there is a closing of whatever possibilities, whatever hopes the community of sexual and gender dissenters in the Soviet Union might have had prior to 1934. So that kind of these hopes evaporated, right, in 1934 with the introduction of recriminalization of male homosexuality. And at the same time, there is this new opening for this Jewish utopia, right? So one utopia or hope of utopia closing down, and another utopia or dystopia, opening up, right? So that was the key to this project, and it was a lot of fun to work on. For example, in this slide, you can see so the globe with the word Pleshka written in Yiddish. So Pleshka is Russian for a gay cruising site, but so I coined this term in the Yiddish language. I think up until this exhibition, the Yiddish vocabulary did not have this particular word for a gay cruising site. And you can see a book on the desk. It's a Yiddish translation of Oscar Wilde, De Profundis, 1926 Yiddish translation of Profundis, of letters that Oscar Wilde wrote in prison while being a prisoner for crimes against morality. The book was published in New York at 26. I got it in the only remaining Yiddish bookstore in New York. And so it was part of my exhibition. And then, so this is how the show looked. So some collages. So this is a picture, well, the picture in the lower right corner is of Harry Hay, which is a major American gay and lesbian activist who found one of the first gay and lesbian rights organizations in the United States, actually in Los Angeles, called the Matashin Society. So he figures in my kind of this narrative, this kind of intergenerational, international community of sexual and gender nonconformists.
Right.
You have some Russian personalities, some international personalities, some Soviet personalities, some contemporary Russian activists, and so on.
Right. So if you allow me to move forward also with an eye on the time. There's another series of works where you combine the name Stalin and homosexuality, as we just saw. And Anna Rose already referenced that some of these works were on display at the Wende Museum in our War of Nerves exhibition. So the title of this body of works is Homosexuality is Stalin's Atom Bomb to Destroy America. I think the title taken from the McCarthy era in the United States, by Arthur Gay Matthews. What is this series about, and what kind of combination are you making here?
Yes, this project is from 2012. And so I came to this project after doing some other work on the history of American Communist Party. And of course, you know, as part of it, I read about the repressions of the American left in general, and specifically of the communist movement here in the US during the McCarthy era, after the war. And then I didn't know it, so it was definitely a revelation for me. I read about the kind of implication of homosexuality into a kind of anti-Soviet paranoia, or Stalinist paranoia, and the general kind of Cold War dynamics and true, genuine fear of a possible nuclear annihilation, nuclear war. So, so I wanted to do something with this project. So I was trying to isolate the most outrageous quotations, the most outrageous quotes that from 2012 felt extremely outrageous, right? So when, for example, US congressmen or government officials would blame, basically would blame homosexuality on a Soviet subversion, of some type of Soviet influence, or some type of Soviet directive, almost. So it's a conspiracy theory, but it was accepted, I guess, by the general public, by many people at least. So I wanted to highlight this in kind of in a farcical way. So it's farce, right? The way I staged it in 2012. But all quotations are accurate. They are in history books. They are in the congressional record. So here you have it, right? So it's a kind of a history of conflation of homosexuality and anti-communism in American history. So, and it felt like it's something that should lend itself to a contemporary project.
Right. Well, we know that history and also our current time can be farcical. And I would say it's very paradoxical in a way that this view of homosexuality as something being imported by the Soviet Union has its parallel in the Soviet Union, where homosexuality was considered to be a capitalist degeneration. So those parallels are quite interesting and striking, I think.
Exactly. It basically, the 1930s, from 1930s until 1960s, we can say that sexual and gender dissenters or nonconformists were one group of people whom the Soviets and the Americans hated equally.
Right.
This was an interesting kind of case where there was a common shared other for both political systems.
Exactly. Yeah. So in the last 5 minutes of our interview, I wanted to ask you about two other projects, the Wayland Rudd Collection and Monument to Cold War Victory. Maybe first briefly about the Wayland Rudd Collection. And Wayland Rudd, of course, was an African-American actor who, because of structural racism in the United States, emigrated in the 1930s to the Soviet Union, where he became something of a celebrity and figured prominently in visual culture, in paintings, posters, etc. And you invited contemporary artists, or you first made a collection of the representation of Africans and African Americans in Soviet visual culture, and then invited contemporary artists to respond to those images. Can you tell us something about that project?
Sure. So this project is from 2010. I started collecting images in 2010, and then the first exhibition was in 2014. So I collected Soviet images from 1970 until 1991, in which Soviet artists or designers would depict life or struggle of Africans or African Americans. So a lot of these images are propaganda images, posters, postcards, postage stamps, but sometimes very observational, very, I would say, kind of quiet and kind of humanist renderings of, let's say, artistic life in Harlem and so on. So such as this painting by Deineka. So in an interesting way, first of all, this collection, and it's a total of 200 images, it mirrors the Soviet art history, right? Because it covers the entire 60 years. But also it creates kind of a interesting body of images to reflect on, precisely because of representation of race by Soviet artists, right? So I was collecting propaganda, I was collecting more observational, kind of humanist, I would say non-propaganda imagery, but I was also collecting advertisements, kind of very, sometimes very questionable or kind of provocative, and to show the scope of the Soviet visual culture in that respect. And then I offered these images to a group of contemporary artists to reflect upon, and an artist engaged with this work and created new contemporary artwork. So for example, artist Glukля, Maria Bayondo, Nikolai Aleynikov, Ivan Brashkin, these are artists whose work we can see on the screen now. So this project is still somewhat ongoing because we're working on a book about this project with Ugly Duckling Press, which is a press in Brooklyn.
Nice, yeah, and maybe during the Q&A we will have the possibility of going a little bit deeper into some of these works. So finally, I wanted to mention the project that is now on screen, Monument to Cold War Victory, which is or was a competition, an international art competition that resulted in an exhibition at the Cooper Union in New York, curated by you and Stamatina Gregory. And yeah, a monument to Cold War victory. That sounds very provocative. What was the idea about it?
Yes. So part of this project is a reflection on the state of monumentality, or how certain complex and unresolved, somewhat unresolved, many people would say unresolved histories could be commemorated. But partially it was also a provocation. It was a provocative call to question whether, so what was the Cold War all about, whether it ended, whether it was a media, whether it was a war in the media, or was it a tangible war? So there was a call for proposals, and a jury selected 17 art projects, commemorative art projects, projects that are commemorating the Cold War, mostly in a very, well, all of them in a very critical, kind of subversive, interesting way. And this exhibition was held at the Cooper Union in 2014. And the book about the project just came out, I think last year, maybe 2 years back. So it was about commemoration, but it was about questioning what does it mean to commemorate, right? What does it mean to commemorate? uh, uh, this strange event, right, that is called the Cold War.
Right. Yeah. No, I think many interesting topics came together here. The politics of memory, the monumentalization, of course, a very um, uh, relevant topic nowadays, the whole discussion about monuments, which, by the way, happens to be the topic of our next Cold War Spaces interview. So let's go for now to the Q&A. It's 12:30, and I'm sure we can come back to some of your projects on the basis of questions, and we already have a few. The first is by Bruce Hollingham. Yevgeniy Fiks, what kind of connections exist today with the Russian avant-garde, constructivism, suprematism, and the world of Lissitzky, Rodchenko, and Tatlin? Although hindered by socialist realism, do artists like you accept one or both movements? It seems to me that the easy way of dealing with socialist realism is to mock it in a manner of Comer and Malamud. What do you think?
Yes. I think there are interesting processes that are occurring in what I see in Russian art, the last couple of years or so. So definitely, the Russian avant-garde is reigning absolutely, splendidly, right, and internationally and within the Russian art scene. But personally, I must say that I was an art student in the late 80s and early 90s in Moscow, and I don't come from a family of artists or creatives. So I really didn't know about the Russian avant-garde up until I was in my 20s. So I guess it was not shown very much, or at least it was not as a commonplace as I find in American art schools, right, where Russian avant-garde is very much part of the curriculum. But I think what I've seen lately mostly in the Russian art circles, but also among art scholars, art historians in abroad, there is an interest in Soviet art that existed in kind of gray areas, maybe between the official art and the unofficial art. And there are so many artists who were not fully socialist realists and not fully avant-garde. And I think some art historians dismiss it as minor or not so interesting, but I think there is a need to dig in and really see, to take a close look beyond the very ideologically driven divide between Soviet art, socialist art, and the avant-garde.
Right, so when the traditional art historical distinction between modern arts on the one hand and socialist realism on the other is a bit artificial, you would say? Or...
I would say so, because even a career of a single artist might transition from being a socialist realist at a certain point, kind of a more dogmatic socialist realist, to a more open, maybe experimental socialist realist, to a social or artist of the Soviet, or from the Soviet Union, let's say, to just an independent maker who happened to live in the Soviet Union.
Right, sure. Okay, and the next question is by N. Bobrov-Hayal. So great to see you here, Zhenya, she says. I love your art for its combination of flights of fancy and storytelling with serious research on unresolved history, a wonderful term. My art uses very similar elements. Do you think of your flights of humor and imagination as seductive tools that draw viewers into conversations about more difficult issues? Or do you think of the relationship of your imaginative elements to your series' historical ones in a different way than I tend to approach them? Well, actually, she corrects and says more serious, difficult issues.
Um, yes, it's interesting. I think I do find, I guess, that a lot of my projects that deal with quite grave issues such as homophobia, let's say, they do have a certain ironic, maybe a little bit of ironic or humorous um, um, uh, kind of quality to it. Maybe it's a certain, I'm not sure how it's produced. I'm not necessarily specifically want to make sure that certain irony, certain humor is present, but I think, but it could be somewhat of a defense, I don't know, mechanism with some type of way of dealing with this also kind of difficult subjects by inserting a little bit of humor into a project. So it's definitely, I see it.
Right. What would you say is the function of humor in reflecting on history, generally speaking?
The introduction of humor, but definitely not for its own sake, right? As a way of, I guess, handle this history or deal with this history, or maybe as Anne mentioned, as a way of creating an entry, right, into a project which otherwise might appear, too heavy, too difficult.
Right. Okay, thank you. Next question is by Daisy Smith, who wants to know whose work is that on the wall behind you?
So this is a painting of mine, and it's from a project, another project on Soviet gay history. So I painted some cruising sites, gay cruising sites in Moscow of the Soviet era, but I painted them in 2012 or 13, something like that. So it's a part of a series of about 10 paintings.
Right, thank you, yeah. So at this point, we don't have other questions, and you are still very much invited to put your questions in the Q&A box, but we still have about 5 minutes. So I would love to ask you, Yevgeniy, if there were a few works that stood out for you in the Monument to Cold War Victory exhibition, and if you can tell us a little bit about these approaches.
Sure. Maybe I can go back to the slide.
Sure.
I should share my screen first. I think there were quite a few amazing projects. And this piece is by Michael Wang called the Mona Lisa gown. So it's a gown that then Jacqueline Kennedy wore at the opening of the Mona Lisa exhibition in Washington, which kind of coincided with the famous crisis between the U.S. and Russia, the Cuban Missiles crisis. And in this project, Jacqueline Kennedy's dress became the monument, right? The monument to this to the Cold War, right? So the gown of the First Lady of the United States as the monument to Cold War victory, I guess, in this case.
And how does that work? How does the gown reflect Cold War victory?
It's an open question, I guess. It's an open question. It's I think the gesture of the artist to to claim that this is the monument, right? So I think, well, I personally found it quite interesting, but I'm not sure what the jury's justification, exact justification was for selecting this this project, because Martina Gregory and I, we were involved into producing the project, but not necessarily picking all the individual projects
Yeah.
for the show.
Right.
So this is a piece by Christoph Drager, which is supposed to be a Marx monument permanently hanging, right? Permanently suspended from a crane, right? So so the crane and the monument becomes the monument, right? So it's kind of yeah, a moment or transition between being a true monument and being dismantled, right? Or taken down.
Yeah, you could even imagine that it's ambivalent because it leaves the possibility that it is being installed or that it is being removed. Yeah.
True.
Okay, thank you. And maybe to conclude, one or two examples as well from the Wayland Rudd collection and the contemporary artist responding to that project.
Sure. A couple of projects, for example, so a piece on your kind of a diptych on your right, in which the color red is used. It's by American artist Brett Scott, and he sees specific images from the 200 images in the Wayland Rudd collection, and he was specifically isolating African-American individuals in those images, isolating them visually. And a piece kind of on the left-hand side with a video monitor. This is a piece by also American artist Cara Lynch, and she did an amazing documentary in late 90s, I think, called Black Russians. And I think this was a pioneering, definitely pioneering in contemporary art project on Soviets of African descent, so Soviets of African American descent. And so she came to Moscow in the mid 90s, did a lot of research, worked on the documentary. Documentary came out, I think, in 99, maybe 2000. But she had a lot of unused footage, a lot of footage that didn't get into her final final film. So she contributed that unedited footage, unused footage from her trip to the Soviet Union in the 90s and her conversation with Soviets of African American descent, and also her I guess diaries, right? She like her address books and the notes that she was making while there. So they were also on displays. Right? I was very happy about this piece. I think it was one of the beautiful projects in that show.
Okay, great, thank you. Let me ask you one final question. What projects are you working on right now?
I'm continuing with projects on Soviet Jewish history, and I've been working already for a couple of years on this project called Yiddish Cosmos, which is about kind of Soviet Jewish narrative overlapping with the Soviet, with exploration of space in general, but also with the Soviet space program. And I'm discovering a lot of amazing material, a lot of amazing kind of stories, personal stories. So I've already showed it a couple of times, but I'm keep getting more amazing contacts and amazing stories. So I think there will be a few more reiterations of the Swedish Cosmos project, a couple of shows on the subject.
Fantastic. Well, Yevgeniy, thank you so much. This was a wonderful insight into your work and the backgrounds of your ideas. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you. Great to be part of the Wende team.
Nice. So next week we have a double interview with Benjamin Forrest and Juliet Johnson from the Geography and Political Science departments at McGill University in Montreal about contested space, communist and Confederate monuments. We're comparing the two. And please notice that next week's program will be a full hour, a 40-minute interview followed by 20 minutes Q&A. I very much hope to see you there and have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.